I know Bugatti are watching this, and I am trying to do you guys proud on building a massive team up together to build all these parts up.
What if Bugatti's biggest mistake was not building the Chiron, but allowing one damaged Chiron to become the most watched independent rebuild in the world? Because the car that once looked like a dead hypercar is now finished. The body is coming together. The rebuild is reaching its final stage. And after years of watching Matt Armstrong fight through one impossible problem after another, the story may be heading towards something much bigger than a car reveal. According to the claims surrounding the project, Matt and Alex Gonzalez were never simply trying to make one broken Chiron drive again. They were building a record. They were collecting information. They were documenting every problem, every obstacle, every part, and every solution. And now that the car is finally finished, all of that information could become far more important than the car itself. Think about what that means. For years, viewers watched Matt standing in a workshop surrounded by parts that most people would never even recognize. They watched him take apart an exotic machine that most mechanics would be terrified to touch. They watched problems appear that seemed impossible to solve. They watched the project survive setbacks that could have ended a normal rebuild. And through all of it, Alex refused to simply walk away from his Chiron. But now the situation is different. The car is no longer a wreck sitting in pieces. It is becoming a finished machine. And when the final chapter of a rebuild arrives, you normally expect the story to end. Take the photographs, start the engine, drive the car, celebrate, move on to the next project. But this time, that may be exactly when the real story begins. Because the biggest question is no longer, can Matt fix the Chiron? The question is, what happens when Matt and Alex take everything they learned from fixing it and use it to challenge the system around the car? That is where this story becomes dangerous for Bugatti. Not because two people suddenly became more powerful than a giant manufacturer, but because they may have created something that is much harder to control: information. Millions of people have now seen the rebuild. They have seen the problems. They have seen the solutions. They have watched an independent team attempt something that many would have considered impossible. And if the claims in the story are accurate, Matt and Alex are preparing to take that public record into a much bigger fight involving repair rights, legal pressure, and independence from the factory system. The most shocking part is that the move may have been forming quietly while everyone was watching the car itself. While the internet was arguing about the Mansory situation, while people wonder whether the bodywork would ever be completed, and while many assumed the Chiron project was simply fighting to survive, something much larger may have been taking shape. And if that plan really comes together, the finished Chiron will not just be a rebuilt Bugatti. It could become the symbol of everything Bugatti never wanted this project to become. To understand why this matters, you have to remember what this Chiron looked like before Matt ever had a chance to finish it. This was not a normal repair job. This was not a weekend project where someone replaces a damaged bumper, plugs in a diagnostic computer, and sends the owner home. This was a machine built at a level where almost everything is expensive, specialized, and difficult to replace. Alex Gonzalez owned the Chiron per sport, and according to the story, he reached a point where the traditional factory route was becoming extremely difficult. Parts were a problem. Access to information was a problem. Diagnostic systems were a problem. Even finding a clear path forward could become a problem. And that created a decision that most owners of a multi-million-dollar hypercar would probably never make. Alex could have given up. He could have accepted that the car was too difficult, too expensive, or too complicated to rebuild independently. Instead, he trusted Matt Armstrong. That decision changed everything. Matt was not a factory technician surrounded by official Bugatti equipment. He was an independent mechanic with a camera, a workshop, a team, and a willingness to keep attacking problems that seemed completely out of reach. And the public was allowed to watch. That last part is important. If this had happened privately, almost nobody would know how the rebuild was done. But it didn't happen privately. Matt documented the process. Every major setback could become part of an episode. Every strange component could become something viewers could study. Every solution could become another piece of knowledge that transformed the Chiron from a private repair into a public experiment. And suddenly, millions of people were learning along with Matt. They were watching him figure out what worked and what did not. They were watching a hypercar that many people would never even see in person being taken apart and rebuilt in front of them. The deeper the project went, the more valuable that record became. Because the real power of the rebuild was not simply that Matt could make the engine run or make the car look complete. The real power was that someone was showing the world what it takes to repair a machine that was never designed to be an ordinary project. That is why the conflict around the Chiron became so interesting. It was no longer just an owner versus a manufacturer. It became a debate about how much control a manufacturer should have over a vehicle after the customer owns it. If an owner cannot get a part, what happens next? If a diagnostic system is restricted, what happens next? If a factory does not support an independent repair, does the project simply stop? Matt's answer appeared to be simple: find another way. And that attitude is what made the project so dangerous from a storytelling perspective. Every time a door seemed to close, viewers want to know whether Matt could find another door. Every time the project looked finished, another problem appeared. And every time that happened, the audience became more invested. By the time the Chiron started looking like a real finished car again, something had changed. People were no longer watching only because they want to see a Bugatti drive. They were watching because they wanted to know where the fight would go next. Then came the setbacks that could have killed the project. According to the script, the battle was not limited to mechanical problems. The story describes disputes over parts, access, suppliers, and eventually the cancellation of the Mansory body kit collaboration. For viewers, that moment was huge because the rebuild had already consumed enormous time and effort. Imagine finally getting a hypercar mechanically close to completion, and then discovering that the final bodywork could become another major obstacle. For a normal project, that might be frustrating. For a Chiron, it could be devastating. But this is where the story takes its biggest turn. Instead of treating every setback as the end, the narrative presents each one as another piece of information. And that is a very different way to look at a conflict. If a supplier changes its position, document it. If a part becomes difficult to obtain, document it. If the repair process reveals a problem with the way independent mechanics access the vehicle, document it. If a company says no, keep the record of what was requested and why. Suddenly, every obstacle has a second life. It does not simply stop the rebuild. It becomes part of the story surrounding the rebuild. The script claims that Matt and Alex had been quietly collecting this kind of material, while the public was focused on the car itself. That is one of the most interesting ideas in the entire story, because it suggests the project had become bigger than a restoration. It had become a case study. Think about the difference. A restoration proves that one person repaired one car. A documented case study can potentially show thousands of people how a difficult repair was approached. It can reveal where the system works, where it becomes difficult, and where independent repairers may need alternatives. And that is why the completed Chiron could matter far beyond its price tag. A multi-million-dollar car sitting in a garage is impressive. A multi-million-dollar car that has become a detailed record of an independent repair is something completely different. It becomes evidence of what is possible. It becomes a reference point for future conversations. And it becomes much harder for people to dismiss the project as simply another internet build. The public has watched too much of it. Too many decisions have been recorded. Too many problems have been shown. That is also why the Mansory cancellation became such an important chapter in the story. The script presents it as something Bugatti may believe would finally stop the project, but the narrative argues that instead pushed Matt and Alex toward a different strategy. Whether that interpretation is ultimately proven is another matter, but as a story, it creates a powerful reversal. The move that was supposed to end the rebuild may have created another reason to continue. The project was no longer simply asking, how do we get this car finished? It was becoming, what can we do with everything we have learned? And that question is much more dangerous because a finished car can be admired and forgotten. Knowledge can spread. Once thousands or millions of people understand how a problem was solved, that information becomes much harder to take back. And then comes the move that could change the entire story. The alleged legal complaint. The script claims that Matt and Alex have moved beyond videos, social media arguments, and public criticism, and have taken their complaints into a formal legal and regulatory setting. That is a major difference. A YouTube video can create millions of views, But a legal complaint creates a paper trail. It puts allegations into a formal process where they can potentially be examined, challenged, supported, or rejected. The script describes allegations involving interference with independent repair, supplier pressure, diagnostic access, and other actions that Matt and Alex believe were unfair or unlawful. Those are serious claims, and they should be treated as allegations unless official records confirm them. But if such a complaint exists and moves forward, it could force the dispute into a completely different environment. Suddenly, the conversation is not just happening between mechanic, an owner, and a manufacturer. It could involve lawyers, regulators, technical experts, and documents. That is where the Chiron rebuild becomes much more interesting, because the public videos may provide context for the story, but the documents would have to carry the serious part of the argument. And that is exactly why documentation could be so important. If Matt and Alex really preserve communications, dates, requests, responses, and technical records, then the story would no longer depend entirely on someone's memory of what happened. There would be a trail to examine. The script also connects the timing of the alleged complaint to wider discussions about right to repair and a claimed Senate appearance. That particular connection needs verification, but the larger point remains important. Right to repair is not just an argument about old cars anymore. Modern vehicles increasingly depend on software, lock systems, specialized tools, and electronic access. The more technology a car contains, the more important access to technical information becomes. A manufacturer can argue that safety and quality require strict control. Independent repairers can argue that owners should not become permanently dependent on one company after purchasing a product. Both sides have serious arguments. That is why this Chiron story could attract attention beyond the automotive world. The vehicle is an extreme example, but the question behind it is simple enough for anyone to understand. When you buy something, how much control should the company that made it still have over your ability to repair it? The Chiron just happens to be one of the most expensive and complicated places where that question can be asked. And if the alleged complaint really does reach regulators, the most important part will not be the dramatic headlines. It will be what the documents actually show. That is where this story will either become a serious case about independent repair or remain a powerful internet controversy. Either way, the finished Chiron has already created something that did not exist before, a massive public record of one independent team's attempt to solve problems normally handled inside the factory system. But the legal fight may only be the beginning. The script then introduces an even more unusual idea. Turn the finished Chiron into a reference point for independent repair. At first, that sounds like a technical detail. It is not. Imagine a mechanic somewhere in the future facing a rare hypercar with a problem that looks impossible. Instead of having no information, that mechanic could potentially study the work already done on Matt's Chiron. They could see which components were used. They could study the methods. They could understand how difficult systems were approached. They could compare parts and see what alternatives were considered. That is the real power of documentation. It can outlive the original project. The script claims that the finished Chiron could be used as an official benchmark or reference vehicle connected to right to repair efforts, with its documentation made available for others to study. That exact legal status should be independently confirmed. But the idea itself explains why the completed car could become more important than just another finished build. For years, manufacturers have had enormous advantages because they possess the technical information surrounding their own products. They know how the systems were designed. They know which components were intended to work together. They know the factory procedures. Independent mechanics often have to discover much of that information through experience. Matt's Chiron project turns that process around. Instead of information remaining hidden inside a factory, the rebuild itself becomes a source of public knowledge. And that is a powerful change. The car becomes a classroom. The workshop becomes a laboratory. The videos become the record. The parts become evidence of what can work. The problems become lessons. That is why the finished Chiron could potentially become a symbol of independent repair. Not because it magically changes every rule, but because it demonstrates what independent mechanics can accomplish when they are willing to spend the time and effort. The script describes this as an ultimate humiliation for Bugatti, but I think there is a more interesting way to look at it. The real issue is not humiliation. It is control. If owners and mechanics can create their own knowledge base, the The manufacturer's control over the repair process becomes less absolute. That does not mean the manufacturer becomes irrelevant overnight. It means the conversation changes. Instead of asking the factory for every answer, independent repairers can start building their own answers. That is a much bigger idea, and it could explain why the finished Chiron matters so much. The vehicle is not just proof that Matt can repair a complicated machine. It could become proof that knowledge about complicated machines does not always have to remain locked inside the companies that built them. The next question is whether the documentation will actually be accepted, recognized, and used in the way the script describes. That is where reality will matter more than hype. But if the project reaches that point, the Chiron could become much more than a YouTube build. It could become a permanent example of what happens when an independent mechanic decides to document everything instead of simply fixing the problem and moving on. Then the story takes its strangest turn yet. The script claims that Matt and Alex have been working toward registering the finished Chiron under a new independent hypercar identity. If true, this would change the way people talk about the car. Instead of simply saying, "This is a rebuilt Bugatti," the project could be presented as something created independently after the original manufacturer's support became difficult. That is an enormous narrative shift. The car begins as a Bugatti. It becomes damaged. It enters an independent workshop. Matt and his team rebuild it. The public watches. And then, according to the claims in the script, the completed vehicle becomes connected to a new independent brand. It is almost like watching a car go through an identity change. But this is also where the story needs the most legal caution. Registering a new business or brand does not automatically erase every connection to the original vehicle. Trademark rights, design rights, vehicle registration, safety rules, ownership records, and other legal issues can still matter. The script currently presents the idea in absolute terms, saying Bugatti would have no authority over the vehicle and would not be able to challenge certain aspects of it. Those statements require legal proof. The more interesting question is what the independent identity would actually mean. Could the team support the vehicle without relying on Bugatti? Could independent suppliers produce parts? Could the repair information remain open? Could the car become a working demonstration of an alternative support model for rare vehicles? Those are the questions that deserve attention. And if the independent brand is real, this could become the point where the project stops being a story about one damaged car and becomes a story about building something new. That is why this part is so clickable. Viewers have watched Matt repair the car. They have watched him overcome mechanical problems. Now they are being asked to imagine something much bigger. What if the finished car is not the end product, but the beginning of a new identity? What if the most important thing Matt built was not the Chiron itself, but a system around it? That would be a far more interesting story than simply showing the car driving down a road. It would mean the years of work created knowledge, relationships, tools, and confidence that could potentially be used on future projects. But there is also a reality check. A new brand does not become successful simply because it has an exciting origin story. It needs customers, legal structure, engineering capability, suppliers, compliance, money, and a long-term plan. That is why the next stage would be fascinating to watch. The rebuild has already proven that Matt can solve difficult problems. The question is whether the team can turn that experience into something that survives outside the workshop. And if they can, the Chiron could be remembered not as the final car of a difficult rebuild, but as the first chapter of something much larger. This is also where Bugatti's possible response becomes important. The current script treats almost every possible response in the company as another victory for Matt and Alex. But the reality could be much more complicated. If Bugatti responds, the company could deny the allegations. It could argue that its policies exist for safety, liability, engineering standards, intellectual property, or other reasons. It could challenge specific legal claims. It could question whether proposed repair standards are valid. It could defend its relationship with suppliers. It could simply refuse to accept the interpretation presented by Matt and Alex. None of those responses would automatically prove either side right. And that is exactly why the next stage could be more interesting than the previous one. Until now, the public has mainly watched Matt solve problems inside a workshop. Now the arguments could move into a world where every claim can be challenged. That creates real suspense. The question is not, who sounds louder? The question is, Who can prove their position? This is where the documentation from the rebuild becomes critical. If Matt and Alex have the records described in the script, those records could help establish a timeline. If Bugatti has technical or legal reasons for its actions, the company would have the opportunity to explain them. A serious dispute is not won simply because one side has more followers. It is won through evidence, law, technical facts, and decisions made by the relevant authorities. That may sound less exciting than saying Bugatti is trapped, but actually gives a story more weight, because now viewers have a reason to keep watching. They want to know what the company says. They want to see the documents. They want to understand what the regulators decide. They want to know whether the independent repair argument survives serious examination. And most importantly, they want to know whether the finished Chiron becomes a one-off success or the start of something bigger. That is the cliffhanger the original story should lean into. Instead of telling viewers that Bugatti has already lost, tell them that the company now has a difficult question to answer. The Chiron exists. The rebuild has been documented. The audience has seen the work. And the conversation about repair rights is already bigger than one car. If the claims about legal action, regulatory attention, and an independent brand are confirmed, then Bugatti will have to respond to something much more difficult than a viral video. It will have to respond to a project that has created years of public documentation and attracted enormous attention. And that is where the title's idea of a worst nightmare becomes meaningful. The nightmare is not necessarily that one mechanic defeated a billion-dollar company. The nightmare is that one damaged car became a public example that other owners and mechanics can learn from. Once that knowledge spreads, it becomes impossible to put the story back inside one workshop. And that brings us back to the finished Chiron sitting at the center of everything. Think about where this machine started. It was damaged. Its future was uncertain. Its owner had every reason to consider walking away. Instead, the car entered a rebuild that became one of the most public hypercar projects on the internet. Matt took on problems that could have stopped the project. Alex continued supporting the rebuild. Viewers watched the story grow. Then came the disputes over parts, suppliers, bodywork, and access. Every setback created another chapter. Every solution created another piece of knowledge. And now the car is finally reaching the point where it can be called finished. Normally, that would be the happy ending. But this story refuses to end there. The finished Chiron is now being presented as the beginning of another chapter. The script connects it to legal action, repair rights, technical documentation, and an independent identity. Some of those claims require confirmation, but the underlying story remains powerful because a car has already done something unusual. It has turned a private repair into a public conversation. That is the part Bugatti cannot simply erase. The videos exist. The audience exists, the knowledge exists, the debate exists, and the car itself exists as the physical result of everything that happened. That is why the next reveal could be more important than the first drive. A first drive proves the car works. A public reveal can prove the project is finished. But what comes after the reveal could determine whether the project actually changed anything. Could the information be used by other mechanics? Could independent repair become easier? Could owners of rare cars learn from the experience? Could this project inspire other builders to attempt repairs that were previously considered impossible?